My name is JD. I'll be the chair of the year. And alongside me, Minjang is going to be handling this round. We have Misanthrope as government, we have Gyeongchalcheong, etc. in opposition. Under the motion, this House believes that police forces should be representative of the demographic profile of community they serve, like what the Prime Minister is supporting.
평화를 추구합니다.
Yeah, me too.
원하지. 평화를 추구합니다.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize inside government that the context of this debate should revolve around areas or communities where it's often volatile, where there are often religious and racial conflicts revolving around the region. There are accusations of police brutality regarding racial biases, like in communities like US, Dallas, or in communities like, like Ferguson, Mr. Speaker. We believe that diverse combination of cultural groups, representation in police force is ever more important in those volatile regions. We're happy to propose. So what do we think we're going to exactly do in our model? We have 3 points to explain to you. Firstly, like if the community is consisted of 80% racial majority versus 20% of racial minority, we think as the motion calls, like the police force should at least reflect 20% of that racial minority. We think that's pretty clear. But we often recognize that such racial characteristics are often intertwined with things like religious characteristics as well. So when we're hiring police officers, we're going to take them into consideration as well. The second point is that we're going to make sure that all police officers that we hire are qualified, they got training, and they got educated, with, to function properly as a police mechanism and police enforcement. But finally, we want to make it clear that this is a supplementary mechanism with many other mechanisms we are going to do with government effort, which is happening in the status quo. For example, placing cameras and police badges to reduce police brutality. For example, hiring experts to culturally educate the police officers, whether you be racial majority or racial minority. We think in addition to that, our policy is necessary and justified. I'm going to talk about 3 arguments today. Firstly, why there's a principal justification as to how public acceptance is very important for police function, how it's a prerequisite for a police function. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why physical presence is very important for that public acceptance, and education is simply insufficient and other measures are insufficient if not for that physical presence. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about what horrible consequences we're confronting as of now in the status quo because racial composition is not reflected. First argument, let's briefly talk about the principle as to why this policy is justified, because public acceptance becomes a prerequisite for adequate police function. The context, as we've explained earlier, Mr. Speaker, is the places where police brutality regarding racial bias is a very volatile problem in these regions. Like we point you to numerous examples. So for example, Michael Brown, like a black boy got killed out of police enforcement, and that caused a lot of riots because that overreaction caused by the police brutality led to riots in Ferguson. We've also seen a lot of cases. For example, Baltimore, US government had to shut down electricity and basic social infrastructure because black people were so mad they were vandalizing everything. They were not cooperating to follow police mechanisms. We think for 2 reasons public acceptance is ever more important for that police to function. Number 1 is because police inevitably have to rely on forcible measures to uphold justice. They're the executive power and the muscle, and they have to do things like, resorting to some form of forcible and violent measures to uphold justice. That is why people accepting that was necessary, people following your ideology and saying that you have clear standard to not impose racial bias when you are using your muscle and force is very important, but that acceptance is not happening in the status quo. No, thank you, sir. But the second reason is local cooperation is very important in catching criminals, especially in communities of racial minorities. We have to know who informants are. If the local pub dude, it can work as an agent in the back alley to give him relevant information about crime scene. Those things are not possible when the police is a white male dude, and the black pub dude is simply, psychologically resistant about white people because he has been exposed to so many media coverages saying that white policeman has been brutal to black boys. We think that is critically problematic. Let's secondly talk about why physical presence then is the only effective solution that we can rely on in today's debate. 3 reasons why. Number 1, we agree, and we are also going to do the education to white police officers to reduce police brutality and understand different races and cultures, and not to impose their racial biases upon black boys. We're going to do that, but that that is insufficient because in the heat of the moment of criminality, when people are engaged in that crime scene or that police enforcement mechanism, people do not completely rationally think, right? They look at the policeman. If the policeman is a white dude, they become automatically psychologically resistant for that, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, the heat of the moment, the characterization of crime scene, make it difficult for people to adequately judge if the police is adequately educated and informed of their culture. Like, it's the mentality between us versus them, and if you make that mentality stay in their constructed identity, that is extremely dangerous. The second reason is regarding cultural sensitivity, Mr. Speaker. Oftentimes, when a Muslim woman is revolved around a sexual crime, it's like religiously impossible for her to talk about this with white male policemen, Mr. Speaker. But if you see a policewoman wearing a hijab next to you, then you feel safe to talk about your crime. Then you feel like instantly connected with the police officer to deal with that crime instances more effectively. That will never happen upon opposition's model. But thirdly and finally, we think, Mr. Speaker, that not all police officers in Baltimore, not all white police officers in Ferguson, it's not reasonable for us to believe that all those white officers were racist and like they hated black people. There were many, many reasonable white police officers, just that people didn't choose to listen because they were, like they were caught up in that heated moment, and therefore that physical presence is ever more important. But finally, the alliance between white police officers and black police officers, like Christian police officers and Muslim police officers, shows the prospect to people that alliance between different cultural communities is possible. That is a very, very positive message, an empowering message that we want to send out to society to have trickle-down effect. Let's secondly talk about why this leads to horrible, horrible consequences. Two things. Number one, what realistically happens when communities rally against the policemen and don't trust policemen is that they oftentimes create their own vigilantes and they rely on local gangsters for security. We think that is horrible and dangerous in the state perspective. We pointed to examples in 2016 in Dallas, Texas. There were cop killers in ghetto regions. There were gangsters that intentionally, selectively tried to kill white cops in forms of revenge, and people were relying to that gangster as security in that community. That was extremely dangerous. We think it's easier for gangsters to use political revenge or like fighting against racial bias as a cover for their gangster actions that nullify state effort and government effort to enforce police mechanisms when communities deny to communicate and cooperate with the state police force, but rather rely on their own vigilantes. Often they are gangsters. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we also pointed to the fact how it creates a vicious cycle of racial tension. Because if racial minorities start to rely on vigilantes for their security, then on the perspective of racial majority, then these black people are just troublemakers because they're not cooperating with white policemen, right? That creates a vicious cycle of racial majority oppressing racial minority again and again, and intertwining certain occupation to a specific race. Like when we think of police officer, like the characterization and the automatic image that we see is a white male, Mr. Speaker. That is problematic when black kids do not have any black police officers to look up to. It's impossible for them to have police officer as their dream occupation. We're very happy to propose.
Speakers spoke for 7 minutes and 33 seconds. I thank the Prime Minister. Now I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition. Please minimize your voices and whisper. Speakers, please.
Mr. Speaker, we think that the better approach to solve racism in general within society is not to force a top-down approach upon individuals in society, but it is rather the best way to approach it is to ensure that everyone within society, regardless of whether or not you are white, whether or not you are black, both races should treat minorities equally within society. We think that the problem that exists within the affirmative side is that not only are they reinforcing the fact that race is a relevant, necessary condition in order to solve racial problems within status quo, this decreases a lot of incentives that already exist that ensures that better uproot, ground root movements occur at the end of the day. What do we support under our side of the house? We support movements like Black Lives Matter to ensure that there is social discussion, there is discourse discourse and there is social consensus among society. The problem with the affirmative side is that Black Lives Matter, they don't necessarily want African Americans to be the representative of them within the police force. That doesn't matter. They want white people to change their behavior and treat them equally within society. We think that this is extremely problematic. The affirmative side merely assumes that African Americans or the minorities is going to represent them to begin with. No, thank you, sir. But second of all, we think that there's going to be additional social divide within the police force that hinders cooperation at the sacrifice of security, Mr. Speaker. Before I move on to my 2 points, which is going to be a discussion